So in this, this isn't an argument so much as it is just I wanted to use the word presentation, and it is, but I think appreciation might be maybe a more accurate word for it. Because when it comes to books and movies, there's so many arguments that could be made, depending on the source material. And we could be here all night, and Daryl's pressured me to make sure we're out of here by 7. And last time I got us locked in here for 15 minutes afterwards, and we had to escape from the library. I hear they're adapting that into a movie next year. So, to get us started on this, the sort of basic terminology of adaptation, in going and looking at this, I noticed that word is largely misused. And it seems to be continuously misused the further we go. When we talk about an adaptation, a lot of people know this by the familiar euphemism of the movie version, or an appropriation, an appreciation. Lately, they've applied the term reimagining or a transposition. That sounds kind of fancy. An alternative conceptualization that was no doubt made up by academics. A cinematic infection. I'm going to get back to that point in just a minute. And then I'm offering this as my own one for it, but a formally printed semi-cooperative celluloid representation. I think that movie adaptations of books, they sometimes stray so far from the original material that might be a more accurate way to describe them than just to say the movie version. So if George Carlin were alive, he'd appreciate the irony of that. But I don't think that adaptation works, because when we talk about movies getting made from books or books being turned into film, that's more of a chronological arc, and it has more to do with the technology and the history than it really does with adapting the material. And those are two things that I feel like often get kind of left out. I don't think that there's much of a pattern to the adaptation, if that's the word we want to use. And if it did existed, or if it still exists, then it's radically changed within the last 20 years. So it's likely too complex and too subjective to ever quantify scientifically, and it's probably resistant to any kind of objective analysis. So if we try to look at what makes a book get turned into a successful film, that's way too big a question to ever say these things need to be done correctly. Because it doesn't take into account the language itself. It doesn't take into account the writer, the plot, the themes, the characters, the perspectives that are chosen, and so on. We're going to see some of those examples why. But in his I'm sorry, I lost my place. My point is, though, that I think that most literature, nonfiction or fiction, is wildly resistant to cinematic adaptation, and it's getting even more complicated than it ever was, and probably going to continue to do so as we keep stepping into the 21st century. Back in the early 1980s, the film critics Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel, at the movies, they famously sat there, and they really popularized the celebrityum of movie reviews in the 1980s. Ebert was doing that as early as the 1960s. But they famously sort of quantified everything as thumbs up or thumbs down. That was their simple pass or no pass recommendation. Go see this movie, don't go see this movie, waste your money on this movie, don't waste your money on this movie. Nowadays, I don't think it's as simple as saying thumbs up or thumbs down. I think we have to start concentrating on the rest of the whole hand. And cinematic adaptations of literary work, well, we can't even do the thumbs up or down anymore. We might have to start concentrating on not just the hand, but the foot, because they're literally becoming that complex. In his 1996 Introduction to Theory of Adaptation, which examines adaptation of literary work specifically, Brian McFarlane, he stated that in view of the nearly 60 years of writing about the adaptation of novels into film, it's depressing to find at what a limited, tentative stage the discourse has remained. And that was 1996. 25 years later, I think we're still kind of there. There's a lot of dispute. Have they adapted it successfully? Have they not adapted it successfully? Every single revision of a literary source just comes under further scrutiny. So it's gaining complexity. I don't at all see this as a bad thing. I think it's wonderful, because the opportunities are maybe more diverse than we've ever had them before. And I'm going to show you why in just a moment. As far as the cinematic infection is concerned, you see it at the top there. I read, and this made my face smile anyway, in 2018, a 2018 interview with Cineaste, a film quarterly magazine, an Argentinian filmmaker named Lucrecia Martel. There's a whole story to be written about her. I've never seen any of her work, but she was interviewed in this magazine. She said that literary adaptation, or excuse me, cinematic adaptation of literary works is akin to an infection because it has absolutely no appreciation for the source material, and it's through the subjectivity of far too many people to ever really appropriate the material, correctly. You have the author who writes it. The reader may not see it the same way. That gets further diced up by the director, the screenwriters, the executive producers, the production company itself, the electricians, the gaffers, the cinematographer, the lighting people, not to mention the ego of the actors. So when she went to go produce a movie of her own as a director, she was adapting a written work that was not her own. And it was then that she gained this really deep appreciation for exactly how complex all of this was. And they asked her, are you going to do this again? Would you like to adapt anything else? And she said, absolutely not. I don't want to continue to spread that infection. And that was the end of the interview. She dropped the mic and left. But she went on in that same interview to relate it to the Roman appropriation of Greek literature and art, which, as I read about it, is the contaminatio, literally the contamination of one piece of artwork into another. Historically, the Romans would reappropriate the Greek works into their own. They would change names, they would change dates. This is basically a form of historical revisionism that they would use to suit their own needs and for their own entertainment purposes. She likened it to that. I don't think that it's on the same scale as that today. If anything, it's just adding, as I mentioned before, a great deal more diversity and complexity that we never granted ourselves before. But she sees some inherent danger with it. It's probably worth noting that that's something to keep an eye on. Adaptation, though, to me, again, I reject that term. I prefer formally printed semi-cooperative celluloid representation. I'm trademarking that, too. I like the sound of it. Adaptation, to me, is too slippery a term because some books, they make great films. We all know that. Some books make great films. Some books make absolutely terrible films. And then, of course, there are some films that are better than the book. These are the discussions that keep us up until 2 o'clock in the morning. It's not an uncommon thing for people to have so many different opinions about this based upon the source material, but hey, these arguments are fun at Thanksgiving, aren't they? So, as we go on to into that, some things that I noticed when I was starting to prepare for this, some raw materials, think of these like basic ingredients, they appear to be common from a literary adaptation into cinema. So when they take a book and they say, I want to make a semi-non-compliant celluloid representation of this book, when I do that, some things always seem to cross over to varying degrees. How much or how successful or unsuccessful this process is, it depends upon the book, it depends upon those doing the adaptation, it depends upon whether or not it's even applicable to a film. But among those things, I tried so hard to pronounce this so many times, the sujet and the fabula, they must remain intact. A lot of scholars agree on that. The sujet is like the concrete order of the plot, whereas the fabula, the Latin word for story, is the actual chronological timeline. Both of those combine to form a narrative. And this sort of relationship was heavily influenced by Russian formalism of the 1920s. That was a literary and then eventually a cinematic methodology for trying to understand what was then celluloid. Movies being brought up as artworks. How well or how effective were they? These are back in the days when they tried to scientifically understand these in ways that, maybe we shouldn't so much. But essentially, the only conclusion they came to is that this is sort of a chicken and the egg argument. Which was better, the book or the movie? Well, if you follow just a simple, the book came first, therefore it's better, so the movie is terrible because it came afterward, well, that's an XY fallacy, and that doesn't work. So they asked a question in Russian formalism, that they eventually couldn't answer. And as I pointed out earlier, in the adaptation theory of cinema, we're still wondering for an answer to that question 8,500 years later. So the thing I was left with this is that there's no real appreciation for the poetic language, that is to say, that's in the literature. A book is a wonderfully dynamic thing. The language that it's written in, whatever language it is, it certainly doesn't need to be just English. These are wonderfully dynamic things that change and have different values for everybody. The semiotics, that is the science of the words, the language, it's different for everybody. If I say a word like beauty, that might mean one thing to me. It might mean something else to everybody else. We all get little different pictures in our head when we hear these things. So a novel and the wording it uses, how could we ever say that one cell or one frame of a movie reel is the perfect encapsulation of that sentence in that book? Whether it's a novel, a collection of poetry, or even something that's nonfiction. Language is a bit too dynamic. Probably too hard to ever say, oh, this is the best representation of this ever. So to me, the argument, which one is best, it's really kind of moot. It doesn't really even need to be asked. Again, it's not thumbs up or thumbs down. Look at the whole hand. That's the beautiful part of it. So when I read through all that, I said to myself, and I used to ask myself this when I was in college too, what really makes something worthy of adaptation? Because I used to write screenplays. And what I always sort of settled on is that it was the essence of the cinematic adaptation. And I say essence, one thing that they always agree for is, the scholars agree for, is the story needs to remain intact. But I started looking at some others too that I'll get to in just a second. First, the silent era. We all in this room are probably at least passively familiar with the silent era of cinema. I wouldn't be surprised if you hadn't seen any of these films because, hey, guess what? A lot of them no longer exist. In fact, the vast majority of them no longer exist. But they were largely dependent upon literary sources, even for material. We think of silent films and we may instantly conjure images of, say, Charlie Chaplin or Clara Bow. But there was a lot of work that was focused on adapting literary works from as early as the 16th century, holy and biblical texts, 17th century, 18th century, a lot of poetry, innumerable adaptations of things like Shakespeare, and so on and so forth, and even recently published adaptations. So in the 1910s, 1920s, when the silent era was in its real heyday, it wasn't uncommon for them to adapt books that were just then published. There's a couple of examples of that exist in a few frames, usually no more than that. In his book, it's a compilation anthology, Harry Waldman, who's a film historian with the National Film Registry, his book is called Missing Reels, which is just awesome. It's really an encyclopedia of a lot of the works that have gone missing. He estimated that something like roughly 2/3 or as high as 80% of the movies of the silent era are now gone. Now, on average, these movies were anywhere from, say, 13 minutes, probably no more than an hour, the equivalent of about 5 reels. And the vast majority of them no longer exist. They have become lost. It's kind of like tragic, they're the ghosts of cinema. We know that a lot of them existed, sometimes only by as much as one frame. And some of the two that we have here, that's all that remains of a cinematic adaptation of Anna Karenina, Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. And then we have over on the right-hand side, Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. Now that's from 1920, do I have it correctly? Oh, there it is. That's from 1920. It starred Lon Chaney, who we all know Lon Chaney Jr. From The Wolfman, but his father, Lon Chaney, was the master of disguise. He was in that. He played Blind Old Pew, if you remember your Robert Louis Stevenson. Great character. Don't Google the picture of his face. It's terrifying. Total pirate face. It's great. But this wasn't even the first cinematic adaptation of that work. This was the 5th. and we still don't have anything more than that and a few other frames of it. All the rest of it is gone. My point is, with these two works and others, it's really difficult for us to gauge exactly how effective these early adaptations were. We don't really have much of an idea except a few things that exist in the editorials. And to go back for a moment to Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, it was the first American adaptation, lost in 1937 with the 20th Century Fox studio fire. That was hard to say. It was a 5-reel production, about an hour long. It was described in Motion Picture News, which is a now defunct sort of newspaper, as a splendid work if unfaithful to its source. So they liked it, but they didn't really like it. And then in 1921, I couldn't find a picture for this because guess what? None exists. In 1921, MGM adapted A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain, and it almost starred Douglas Fairbanks, but at the last minute he opted out. We don't have any surviving stills of that. That one was completely lost in the same fire at 20th Century Fox. But that one seems to have been a little bit more successful as a celluloid representation. It was faithful but too contemporaneous adaptation, and that's what Harry Waldman wrote in his book. And then as far as Treasure Island is concerned, which is, again, the still on the right-hand side, and that's one of the only few remaining frames from it, it again starred Lon Chaney as Blind Old Pew. It was described by Harry Waldman, which came from an unknown periodical at the time, in 1920, as a vivid yet disturbing adaptation. Its attention to detail was expertly crafted as to leave all but those not on the lookout unable to guess just what it is that they missed. So that one in 1921, Treasure Island, which again was only the fifth adaptation of Robert Louis Stevenson's work, seems to have had some success in being faithful to its source material. Some success. It's a shame that we'll never know. But when we look back, we could see at least the good intentions were there to sort of maintain the integrity of the book. They knew they were putting it into a movie, but they said, no, there's something more to this. We can't just action. We have to transgress the medium in some way. So it'd always be nice to find those. If you have a yard sale or something, be on the lookout for old film canisters. They're worth quite a bit of money. Reminds me of that spider pit scene from the lost reel of King Kong in 1933. I keep looking for that at garage sales in Lake County. I'm 41. I still haven't had any success. But if anyone's having a garage sale this coming weekend, please let me know. The real divisions, I think, when it comes to a literary adaptation going into film, is the real challenges are an emphasis on theme. These are the simplest narrative devices, but they become the most important. The perspective of the characters, the narrators, if it's multiple narrators, an omniscient narrator. The historicity of it, is it even accurate? I've got some examples to show you of that quickly. And then the attention, as I mentioned, to the language, the poetic detail. Well, that could vary difference by difference. I think this is why they keep on making Spider-Man films. They keep trying to capture the magic of the original comic book series. They haven't quite done it yet. But who knows? Spider-Man number 105, we might finally get there. We'll see. But these things seem to carry over very frequently as we go from the page to the screen. And I think with usual success. There's a little bit of a catch to it sometimes, though. And I've got some examples I just wanted to read to you, if I may. So in addition to those materials, theme, perspective, the historicity, that is to say the accuracy, and the attention to the poetic language, the detail, these factors, I call them agitators. They don't always work. Cormac McCarthy published The Road, his sort of poetic, prosaic, dystopic novel in 2006. It was an instant success. It won the 2007 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. It was on Oprah's book club. It was BBC's top most influential novels of the 20th century, or I'm sorry, of the last 50 years. And it made a huge splash, despite the fact that it was a rather grim story. Beautiful book. wonderful book. I mean, you're enthralled by it if you have the tissue box handy. But then they adapted it into a film in 2009. And I found a quote in here from a couple critics and one reviewer. And the one that, excuse me one second. The one that stood out to me the most, it was in the Village Voice, a critic referred to the novel as a fast-paced, sort of, very soul-searching read, and referred to the cinematic adaptation of it as a sluggish, boring, soppy, wet heap of newspaper. And I was like, how does a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, granted, about very grim subject material, get turned into a movie that the critic is saying, yeah, it worked that well in the book, but it was that grueling an experience on film? Something has to make that magic happen. Something is the solution to that argument. And I think it's a good thing that we're still trying to figure that out. I hope that continues for quite a while. Some ongoing examples of this. It's not Spider-Man. I pick on that because every year they come out with a different one. But first example, James Fenimore Cooper, The Last of the Mohicans. He published those books between 1823 and 1841. There were, I think, 7 of them total, and they all were based around Natty Bumppo, the deer slayer, long rifle, who was half white, half Indian, sort of absolute pinnacle pioneersman of James Fenimore Cooper's writing, and he was usually the protagonist, if not included as a side character. They were largely historically inaccurate. They were based more upon Cooper's impressions of what he had read, oftentimes in sort of pulpy leaflets and magazines. He had not visited some of the places and where the stories take place, so their historicity was way off, way off. Another one that, between adaptation of a literary source into cinema, offers some interesting examples are all the Frank L. Baum books of The Wizard of Oz. The Fairy Log and Radioland plays was the first cinematic adaptation of The Wizard of Oz. That was 1910. Okay, so it goes back quite a ways. In fact, it was financed and produced by Frank L. Baum himself, who ended up, ironically, needing to pay back the investors because the movie was a complete financial failure. So his producers came to him and said, hey, we want our money back. And he ended up having to sell the rights, the movie rights, to his own book, which is a huge historical irony. But we continue to evolve this cinematically in multiple platforms as video games, stage plays. We do it in songs and music. There are fan fiction and parallel novels that have been based upon this series, and the list goes on. And then there's my favorite one, at least on this list. I don't mean favorite novel, Bram Stoker's Dracula. I was going to get into a long-winded discussion of this one, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to say there's more than 200 cinematic adaptations of Dracula that either directly involve the character and/or have been based upon that book by Bram Stoker. My personal favorite one is Billy the Kid versus Dracula. And if you ever find yourself really bored late at night on YouTube, please look it up because it's amazing. So I strongly encourage you to check that one out. He has a gunfight with Dracula, and Dracula is like repelling bullets with his cape. It's priceless. We need to remake this. So one interesting thing before I wrap this up, and this is the second to last one, I just call this drafts on the cutting room floor. When you write something, it goes through multiple drafts. When you make a picture, a motion picture, it's edited, and what doesn't make it into the film, they used to say it ended up on the cutting room floor, whereas nowadays the production companies have gotten really wise and just now included that on the bonus disc DVD. Yeah, never a dollar wasted, never an income opportunity wasted. But there's this weird misfit with literary adaptations transgressing over into cinema. And it's parallel fiction, or the parallel novel. They exist in the same world as the novel, but they're not exactly like a sequel. They're not a prequel. They don't classify as something in the continuance of the timeline. They sort of stand alone, and there's some really good examples of this stuff that for whatever reason just hasn't quite caught on yet. I'm kind of waiting for this one to have a major impact, but John Gardner's book Grendel, that won the National Book Award, I believe. It was a Booker Prize winner or finalist, I believe. That was adapted, God bless you, that was adapted as Eaters of the Dead by Michael Crichton, and then later adapted as The 13th Warrior, directed by John McTiernan. None of those were entirely successful. John Gardner's was well received critically, but the movie adaptations have yet to really work. Robert Zemeckis discovered that the hard way because he keeps pushing that CGI format, which is improved, but I still prefer Pixar. The Wide Sargasso Sea is a companion piece to Jane Eyre. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, a companion piece to Hamlet. Tom Stoppard ended up adapting Rosencrantz and Guildenstern first as a stage play in the 1960s, and then eventually as his own film in the 1990s. So, talk about obsessed. He was clearly a huge Shakespearean fan. But that one has been always well received and been very popular as a play since the 1960s. So this parallel fiction, when it comes to adaptation, hasn't quite found its market yet, but it seems to work rather successfully. And then from 2007, the author's name is escaping me right now, but I think his last name is Cheever, I want to say. It doesn't matter. But Finn is a companion piece to Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, and it's about Huck's father. And it's kind of this deep, cathartic novel from Papa Finn's perspective, in which he explains the reasons for his abuse towards his son, the despair of his alcoholism and his gambling addiction, and how he finally ends up in that house on the Mississippi River, floating down before it breaks apart. And it was a really interesting read. Maybe could have been written better. We won't have that discussion. But I think for the most part, it was overall successful. And it was still an interesting companion or parallel piece. Last but not least, adaptations today. I chose my wordage on this very carefully, and then I changed it at the last second. They tend to have, when we adapt a literary work into a film, they tend to be higher award winners. They win more awards. When we adapt a book into a film, they tend to be better box office winners and better box office receipts and better reviews. And they tend to get higher critical praise from professional film critics. I use the term higher as opposed to, biggest or most, because that has been largely inconsistent. Higher just means on average, right? It's the comparative as opposed to the absolutist most. So we don't want to go down that route. But I think it kind of demonstrates that the trend for what makes a book a successful film, we're still working on it. And I don't think that that's anything except a good thing, because it always means we've got more room to improve. Got several different perspectives on the same work. We may never figure it out, and I don't even see that as a problem. I think that should make all of us happy. It certainly makes the production companies happy, because nowadays the publisher houses and the film production companies have either merged, or the publishers have set up their own independent sort of production studios to handle things like production, distribution, and exhibition of a film. It's not uncommon for many different publishing houses to start talking to their authors, their prospective authors, about the intended film rights of their work before the book is even finished. Now, that's not a new thing. Graham Greene did that with The Third Man before he wrote the screenplay for what became the Orson Welles adapted film. That was back in, I believe, 1947. And he tried to write it as a novel, didn't work, sat down with Joseph Cotten, got a sense of the character of Harry Lime, and I can't remember Joseph Cotton's character name in that, but got a sense of the character, then went and wrote the screenplay first. It got made into a film, and then Graham Greene, poet and author, turned around and wrote the book based upon the screenplay. So I think that that negotiation is continuously happening, and now it's just more dynamic than ever, which is awesome, because we're never going to run out of this one's better, no, this one's better, no, this one's better. That Thanksgiving discussion is covered into the 22nd century easily. So, and that's it. That's all I got. Thank you very, very much. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy just to stand here for a a little while.